Welcome to the Embodied Carbon and Procurement Policy session of our Regional Hub Policy Series. My name is Megan Lewis, and I'm a Senior Policy Researcher at the UW Carbon Leadership Forum. This is the third of 6 sessions provided by the CLF to give an overview of the existing landscape of policy opportunities related to embodied carbon. This presentation will cover why procurement, highlights from the current landscape, key components of procurement policies, and the development process and stakeholders that we've seen related to procurement policy. As described in the first session, there are a large number of strategies, tools, and policy measures available to achieve reductions in embodied carbon, as summarized on this slide. This session will focus on policies that impact the process of product selection during the design and construction process, when the type of material to be used has already been selected by the design team and the contractor is working with them to finalize which manufacturer and product will be installed on the project. It is possible for procurement policies to cover other embodied carbon reduction strategies in phases of design and construction, but we're covering those policy design considerations in other sessions, given the huge amount to discuss just with this specific type of government procurement policy that we'll be covering in this session. So diving right in, starting with why procurement. So a common type of procurement policy in the US is called Buy Clean, which is a policy that uses a combination of disclosure, incentives, and standards to leverage the purchasing power of public agencies to encourage a shift towards lower carbon options in the broader construction materials market. Buy Clean is an approach that can be applied at the federal, state, or local level and can also be used by private building owners. This slide summarizes 5 common components of Buy Clean and similar procurement policies that I'm going to walk through later in this presentation: scope, disclosure, standards, incentives, and compliance mechanisms. I'm going to be using the phrase Buy Clean to refer to a larger group of policies that all follow this framework throughout this presentation. Government procurement is the process by which the government acquires the goods and services it needs by purchasing from commercial businesses. Since agencies of the government use taxpayer money, there are a number of regulations on how to use it properly and responsibly. Procurement policies leverage money that is already being spent to increase the availability of embodied carbon data and achieve embodied carbon reductions. We used US Census Bureau data to get an estimate of the relative contribution of the public and private sector to embodied carbon in the United States, summarized in the pie chart on the right, and found that about 1/3 of embodied carbon in the US was attributed to public projects between 2008 and 2018. Additionally, public procurement is disproportionately responsible for the procurement of the carbon-intensive materials cement and steel. Just under 50% of US cement use and 1/5 of steel is purchased with US tax dollars. This demonstrates the significant potential for emissions reductions from public procurement alone. Second, Buy Clean policies focus on procurement of a short list of carbon-intensive materials, targeting the hard-to-abate industrial sector emissions from materials like steel and cement that altogether comprise nearly 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Buy Clean can increase supply chain and purchasing transparency around not only greenhouse gas emissions or embodied carbon, but also working conditions, manufacturing locations, and other data that can help align public procurement with environmental, labor, and equity goals. Third, addressing supply chain emissions at the point of purchase can help address the carbon loophole that occurs when companies or governments only account for carbon emissions within their accounting borders. So the majority of a product's embodied carbon footprint is generated across its supply chain, which may be spread all over the world. According to the Carbon Disclosure Project, for the average company, supply chain emissions are around 11.4 times greater than direct emissions from their operations. In the context of state or federal procurement policy, when we focus on limiting only industrial emissions generated within the borders of a state or even the entire United States, rather than accounting for a product's global supply chain by considering embodied carbon, this can result in the outsourcing of emissions across borders rather than actual emissions reductions. This means that you're just moving around emissions rather than actually reducing them. And given the magnitude of emissions in supply chains, this carbon loophole is an urgent issue for addressing the climate crisis. In the US, BuyClean is the most quickly growing type of policy that we've seen focused on embodied carbon. Since the first policy of its type, BuyClean California, was passed in 2017, 3 additional states, Oregon, Colorado, and New York, have passed related policies. And in 2021 alone, BuyClean-like policies were introduced in 8 states. At the federal level, a federal BuyClean task force was launched following the federal sustainability plan signed by President Biden in Executive Order 14057 in December. And the GSA has adopted new requirements in the P100 as of March 2022 that set lower carbon procurement standards for concrete and asphalt. There's also a lot of activity internationally related to BuyClean. The Canadian national government is working to develop a BuyClean policy as part of its Greening Government initiative. And international efforts to harmonize green public procurement are being led by initiatives like the UN Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative. Given the speed of policy development, we recommend checking out our policy toolkit to see introduced and passed policies across the globe, with the link right here. This slide provides a snapshot of the current landscape in the US in terms of what is passed and what has been introduced, but not yet passed. So passed and signed farthest to the left, and then still introduced, but not yet passed on the right. You can see there's a lot of variation in the material scope, the project scope, or whether it includes buildings or transportation projects, current policies, as well as in whether they set standards or provide incentives. I'm now going to walk through the elements I mentioned earlier that are also summarized here for current policies, and dive into some of these policy elements deeper and highlight what we are seeing in US policy. Starting with scope. The first thing we need to understand about a policy is which materials and projects are in the scope of the policy, often referred to as what materials or projects are eligible or covered. Most proposed bills that we've seen include both vertical and horizontal infrastructure, meaning they include both buildings and transportation projects. The most frequently included materials are concrete and steel, including ready-mix concrete, structural steel, and reinforcing steel. Other included materials in order of popularity include asphalt, engineered wood, glass, insulation, and certain finishes, such as carpet, wallboard, and ceiling tile. Next, I'll dive into the most consistent requirement we've seen in BuyClean, which is a requirement for projects to disclose an environmental product declaration, or EPD, for covered materials used on covered projects. EPDs, which are often referred to as nutritional labels for building materials, like the example here on the right, although many of them do not look just like a nutritional label like this, are third-party verified documents that report the environmental impacts of a product based on the results of a life cycle assessment, including its global warming potential, or GWP, which is how we measure embodied carbon. So that's in this example here, you can see global warming potential 271. That's the embodied carbon. The development of EPDs is guided by international standards set by ISO, as well as industry-specific rules set for each product called product category rules, or PCRs, which are developed through a fair and open stakeholder development process that's required also by ISO standards. EPDs are ideal for use in BuyClean policies because they enable the selection of the best possible material only when you're comparing functionally equivalent products. So functionally equivalent products would mean you're looking at 2 concrete mixes of the same strength, 2 pieces of rebar that could serve the same function. And then you're looking at their actual performance as measured by an LCA and communicated in the EPD. EPDs can capture a range of practices and facilities, from plant energy efficiency and renewable energy use to sourcing recycled content. And this enables companies across the materials supply chain to pursue and communicate the clean manufacturing solutions that are right for their facilities and products. And this is particularly important for embodied carbon because we know there are still technologies and solutions that are developing that right now we don't know about. And so by using something like an EPD, we can allow for manufacturers to continue developing those and communicating the results of their decarbonization work through LCA without continually changing and adding requirements into policies. There are two primary types of EPDs, which I'll cover now. So industry average EPDs and product specific EPDs. So first, industry average EPDs. If you want to understand the typical environmental impact of a product, an industry average EPD is the best tool because it communicates the typical manufacturing impacts for a range of products from a group of manufacturers. These are often organized through a trade association that represents that group of manufacturers. The second category of EPD is called a product-specific EPD, which communicates the impacts of a specific product from one manufacturer, but it may be across multiple of their facilities. So for example, if one manufacturer produces carpet in 5 different factories, but it's the same carpet product, they could average those and present those impacts in one product-specific EPD. There are 2 additional types of EPDs that are subtypes of product-specific EPDs that are also referenced in Buy Clean policy. So the first was defined by Buy Clean California and is called a facility-specific EPD. This is a product-specific EPD in which the environmental impacts can be attributed to a single manufacturer at one manufacturing facility. So essentially, this excludes the option of averaging across multiple manufacturing facilities that I mentioned on the previous slide. The second subtype is a supply chain specific EPD, which was defined in HB 1103 or Buy Clean Buy Fair Washington. And it's a product specific EPD where the upstream processes are modeled with supply chain specific data, such as data from the cement plant for a concrete EPD and data from the steel mill for a structural EPD, for a structural steel EPD. And if you want to learn more about any of these types of EPDs, I recommend our report, EPD Requirements and Procurement Policies. Well, industry average EPDs are helpful for understanding and potentially setting industry average baselines or limits, which may be used in a policy. An industry average EPD cannot be used to compare products. So a manufacturer could not submit one to comply with Buy Clean, for example. And to help illustrate why, so this would be like if a car manufacturer provided you the average miles per gallon for all cars in the United States when you asked them what the fuel efficiency of the specific car you were purchasing from them was. And you definitely wouldn't want that manufacturer to use the average miles per gallon for all cars in the US if they were complying with something like a clean fuel standard. And so this is why both of these types of EPDs are relevant to policy, but the only kind that we want manufacturers to submit to actually comply with policies are those on the right here, the product specific EPDs or the facility and supply chain specific versions of those. The number of EPDs has grown substantially since the publishing of the first EPD standard in 2012, and quite a bit since Buy Clean California was first passed in 2017, which you can see here. There were less than 5,000 EPDs available when Buy Clean California was passed. And just 5 years later in 2022, there are nearly 90,000 EPDs in the EC3 database. I think this speaks to a couple things. First, this growth in EPDs is really exciting to see. It has been encouraged by development of policies, but we need more transparency from all manufacturers, not just the sustainability leaders that are really represented by this growth. And it also shows that why this the disclosure phase-in process that we see as part of a lot of policies, which I'll talk about in the compliance part of this presentation, where there might be disclosure required for several years before limits or incentives are provided. And you can see how much of a difference that a couple of years can make when you consider something like Buy Clean California passed in 2017, and now limits are being established in are now required as of 2022. And there's been this giant growth in EPDs that we expect to see continue. One last note on disclosure is that procurement policies may include other requirements besides global warming potential. So for example, the Buy Clean Buy Fair Washington bill proposed in 2021 includes labor reporting requirements and health impacts with a goal of promoting higher labor standards in manufacturing by incorporating climate and other types of pollution impacts in the quality of working conditions into the procurement process. Procurement policies, similar to other regulations or green building certifications, often include either reduction targets or limits. And I'm going to dive into examples of both of those now. So first, we'll talk about global warming potential limits, which are already in use by several policies in the US. So GWP limits set a maximum allowable value for the carbon intensity, or the carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of a project or product as measured by a life cycle assessment. As you can see here on the right, one way that these limits can lower over time is the method used by BikeLane California. So in California, every 3 years, the limits published will lower as needed to reflect the industry average, since the industry average is the value that's been required by the policy to where that maximum allowable value for carbon intensity will be set. So that means that it'll be gradually lowering over time alongside improvements in technology and other decarbonization strategies. And here are their performance standards, or the GWP limits, published by California for eligible products. And in California, the eligible products are here. So structural steel, concrete reinforcing steel, flat glass, and mineral wool board insulation. By setting a limit at the industry average, BikeLane California aims to cut emissions from the worst polluters while ensuring that meeting the policy is still achievable for a typical manufacturer. And if you want to learn more about how California arrived at these values, read more on the DGS website, which is linked here, or in the CLF report, BikeLane California Limits, which is published in January 2022. A second option for setting reduction requirements is to set reduction targets from a baseline. This requires setting an initial baseline carbon intensity. So again, that carbon dioxide equivalent per unit that a project or product must reduce from. So baselines could be for a specific year, or they could be a third-party value like the CLF material baselines, which I'll talk about in a minute. An example of this type of policy for materials would be the language used in the LEED v4 pilot credit, which awards points to teams that achieve a percentage reduction from the CLF material baselines. Policies with reduction targets may lower more linearly over time than the first example I gave of the strategy that's used by BikeLane California of sort of lowering alongside industry average. So for this second option, requiring percentage reductions by certain dates like 2030 or 2050, as shown in this diagram, you can see that this example policy set an initial target in 2020 and then required a 50% reduction by 2030, and with the goal of reaching net zero by 2050. Lowering in limits in this way guarantees reductions over time, but it may not match the pace that's feasible for the development of technology or decarbonization strategies, or the actual available supply of low carbon materials to actually meet the demand. So both of these approaches have pros and cons, and we will just have to see over time which makes the most sense for embodied carbon policies. The CLF publishes annual material baseline report that includes low, typical, and high carbon footprint values. So the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per unit of product, similar to the values showed in the BikeLane California example a couple slides ago. And we publish these for over 30 products. These are updated annually to reflect the rapid growth and available data on the embodied carbon of products through EPDs. Currently, policies are typically using either the typical or high values that are included in this report, and not currently directly referencing the values that are in this report, but also using the 50th and then which is the typical, or the 75th or 80th percentile, the high values respectively. We have not seen significant use of policies that incentivize projects and their suppliers to strive for the low or the sort of best practice values for the carbon footprint of products, which could be used as part of performance incentives, which we'll talk about now. Incentives are a vital policy instrument for phasing in new types of policy requirements, which most embodied carbon requirements are. Building capacity for the building industry to comply with policies, motivating continued innovation. These are all benefits of including incentives in policies. There are two primary types that we've seen in embodied carbon policies that have been already introduced or passed. The first type focuses on rewarding high performers rather than excluding the worst polluters, which is the focus of standards or limits that we just talked about. Examples of this type of incentive would be purchasing preference incentives that evaluate suppliers and products on carbon and cost, or performance incentives for achieved reductions like a financial reward to a contractor, similar to what might be rewarded for finishing a project ahead of schedule. The second type provides direct financial support that supports policy compliance. And this could be tax credits or other direct financial rewards for developing EPDs or low carbon products. There are many other options that could exist. One is included here of other types of incentives that are possible. So New York's Climate Forward Concrete Leadership Bill, which is currently in session, would require expedited product evaluation for low carbon concrete products by the Department of Transportation in New York. This type of incentive is striving to address a specific challenge and to help low carbon products emerge more quickly on the market. Here are two examples of direct financial support incentives. So on the left, the Oregon Concrete EPD program provided technical and financial support to suppliers creating concrete EPDs in Oregon. It resulted in over 1,500 EPDs across 20 different Oregon concrete plants. This program was really helpful in supporting compliance with the Portland low carbon concrete policy. A similar program has been proposed now as part of Buy Clean Oregon, which just passed in February 2022. A different mechanism would be through providing tax credits to manufacturers that create EPDs, and this was proposed in the original version of New York LECLA, which was passed in 2021. An example of purchasing preferences would be both of the bid discount rate examples that are here. Both of these were proposed in the original New York LECLA bill as well, but were not in the actual language that was passed in 2021. So these diagrams show two versions of what a discount rate could look like. On the left, a performance discount rate, which essentially sets a carbon standard and then gives a bid price discount to the bids above that number. The second, on the right, a sliding discount rate means that the bids would be ranked by their carbon performance. And then the top bid would be given a larger price discount, let's say 5%. The second could be given a 3% discount, et cetera. The point of these discounts rates is to incorporate carbon into the existing bid process. So by rewarding manufacturers with lower carbon products, by making their prices more competitive and therefore more likely to be selected. This approach is more popular in the private sector, I'll say, by corporate leaders on embodied carbon reductions, but it's not yet been passed into legislation. And the last key component of procurement policies I'm going to cover today is compliance, which describes the process by which stakeholders in the building industry actually show that they have met the requirements of a policy, as well as what governments can do to make it easier for those stakeholders to do so. Policy compliance is really important because you have to balance ambition and feasibility, because policies that are difficult to comply with are likely to result in less actual embodied carbon reductions. So, you can have the most ambitious policy language, but if no one can actually meet it, then that policy is not going to have its intended impact. I've included some examples here of strategies that can be used by government agencies to ease compliance and increase the success of a policy. So examples are raising awareness through free education and training sessions, using pilot projects to test requirements, allowing for policy exceptions and waivers, also known as hardship clauses, and providing early adoption incentives. The Portland Low Carbon Concrete Program used the strategy of a multi-year phase-in process to increase compliance, starting with the 3-year period during which disclosure of product-specific EPDs for concrete products used in Portland was required. And this also allowed time for data collection, pilot projects, and discussion of the proposed limits with an advisory committee. In 2023, the maximum global warming potential limits will be published and required on Portland projects. The Washington legislature funded a Buy Clean, Buy Fair reporting database and pilot projects using the strategy of creating an easy-to-use, standardized reporting interface for project teams and testing requirements on pilot projects to increase success of future Buy Clean policies. This diagram shows the flow of data that will be collected from pilot projects, which will relieve burden on Washington state agencies and project managers across many teams who would otherwise have to create separate reporting systems and documents to verify compliance from contractors and suppliers. Over time, this will also allow Washington to easily track emissions reductions that are achieved through the policy, as well as changes in labor conditions and facilities that they procure from. Now that you have an in-depth understanding of all the pieces of procurement policies like Buy Clean, you may be wondering what the typical development process and stakeholders are for this type of policy. This graphic focuses on how different stakeholders are involved in informing policy development. Every policy is different, and not all procurement policies are set through legislation, such as those inspired by executive order or passed through a city ordinance. But this outline will hopefully help you understand what a typical process could look like at the state and federal level. First, farthest here on the left, constituents and advocacy groups build awareness and support for an issue or specific policy. This is an example of a role that is often played by the Carbon Leadership Forum and its regional hubs, raising awareness about the issue of embodied carbon and the urgency to use policy as a tool to reduce these emissions. Once an idea has gained enough momentum, legislators will draft policy language, often with the help from advocacy organizations like those with the logo shown at the bottom of the slide. Next, feedback is collected from subject matter experts to strengthen the bill language and from stakeholders to increase support from potential opponents. This again is an area where our team at the CLF has played a role of providing subject matter expertise to strengthen bill language related to embodied carbon. The drafted policy language becomes a bill when it's introduced by a legislator and the legislative process begins. It may be several years over multiple legislative sessions before a policy gains enough support to pass. Once the bill does pass through the legislature, leadership on the contents of the policy generally transitions from the legislature to a government agency that leads development of the policy. This may include a public comment period or an advisory group where stakeholders have another opportunity to provide feedback. And last, the policy goes into effect and impacted stakeholders are required to comply per the rules established by the agency and policy. But there still may be opportunities to engage, such as helping partnering with agencies to help provide education to impacted stakeholders and some of the other strategies that we discussed in the compliance section. So in summary, government procurement is an effective tool for reducing embodied carbon for carbon intensive materials and is an increasingly popular type of policy in the US and around the world. Tips for policymakers getting started on developing low carbon procurement policies like Buy Clean are starting with a short list of a few high impact materials where they spend the most money, and then phasing in additional materials over time. Requiring transparency in the form of type 3 product specific EPDs or other types of product specific EPDs. Where data is already available, emissions reductions limits or targets can begin to cut out the most emissions intensive products on the market. And performance or financial incentives can help increase innovation and build capacity to comply with increasingly rigorous policies. Last, phasing in requirements over time and using strategies like pilot projects and partnering to provide free education opportunities related to the policy components can increase compliance and success over time. And with that, thank you for your time. And please go to the Carbon Leadership Forum website to find other sessions a part of this policy training series. Thank you.